Howdy. So our guest is actually a former professor here at the University of Texas, but he's from across the river. As he said, we say he's on the wrong side of the Brazos, but he used to be here. He's got a book. He's going to talk today about kind of the presidency, but one of my favorite books is First American, a book he did about... Mike's not on. Can you hear me now? All right, great, better. So he's going to talk, one of my favorite books of all time, is a book he did, First American, a book about Benjamin Franklin. If you haven't read the book, I encourage you to go out and buy a copy. It's a great book, but tonight he's going to talk about kind of the, maybe the accidental president, but he's here for President's Day. Was a professor here at Texas A&M and then moved across the river to the University of Texas, but we'll forgive him for that. He is H.W. Brands, Bill Brands. He was born in Oregon. He went to college in California and sold cutlery across the American West and earned graduate degrees in mathematics and in history in Oregon and Texas. He taught at Vanderbilt University, Texas A&M University before joining the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin, where he holds the Jack Blanton Sr. Chair in History. He writes on American history and politics, writes books. His books include Dreams of El Dorado, Heirs of the Founders, The Generals versus the President, The Man Who Saved the Union, Traitor to His Class, Andrew Jackson, The Age of Gold, The First American, and TR. And he's actually working on a book right now, which I hope he'll talk a little bit about tonight. Several of his books have been bestsellers too. Traitor to His Class and The First American, my favorite, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Please welcome to the podium Bill Brands.
Thank you, Warren, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be back at the Bush Library and delighted to be back at Texas A&M. I have for some years been teaching a course in the history of the presidency. And on the first day of the class, this is the slide that I put up for my students. And here's our first president, and here's our current president, and their job for the final exam is to explain. How did we get from there to there? Now, I have to tell you that I started teaching this class when Bill Clinton was president. So Bill Clinton was on the right-hand side. And this is the challenge for somebody who is teaching the history of the presidency. How did we start with George Washington and wind up wherever we happen to be? And I'll tell you that this idea that, I don't intend that the students infer anything about whether there's been a progression or a regression or anything else. It's just, here's our first president, here's our current president, what's the connection? But Henry Adams, who was a great American historian, once cited the progression, or he would have said the regression, from George Washington to Ulysses Grant. And Henry Adams was alive during the administration of Grant. And he said that anybody who observes that understands that Charles Darwin is utterly wrong. There is no evolution to a higher order. It goes in just the opposite direction. So I have set for myself today the challenge to compress into 40 minutes what takes me 14 weeks when I teach my class. But I'm going to do it in a relatively straightforward way. I'm not going to cover all of the presidents. I'm just going to cover the most important ones. So let me ask you, who are these important ones going to be? George Washington, he's going to be the first, and he's important because he was the first. That's the main reason he's important. But if I told you, for example, that there were going to be 6 presidents on my list, after I leave, who's going to be the next one after George Washington? Any guesses? If I included Jefferson, there would be too many. He's too close. So I have, pardon? Andrew Jackson. That's right. Andrew Jackson's going to be the next one. And after Jackson, who do you think is the obvious one? Abraham Lincoln. We're doing very well. After Lincoln? Theodore Roosevelt. After Theodore Roosevelt? Franklin Roosevelt after Franklin Roosevelt? Okay, this is where opinions differ. You'll see it could arguably have been Lyndon Johnson, but it's not. It's going to be Ronald Reagan. And then, well, we'll get there. Okay, so here's our first president, George Washington. What is it that is important about George Washington's presidency? Now, I'm going to tell you that one of the principles that I have concluded from teaching and writing about presidents is that if you study presidents at the same time you are studying the people who elect presidents, there is this very close symbiosis between presidents and voters. And if there's a single principle that underscores presidential politics and how individuals get to be president, I'd put it this way. We get the president we deserve. So in order to understand who becomes president, you have to pay attention to who is doing the choosing. So the thing about George Washington is there weren't very many people doing the choosing. In George Washington's day, even among adult white males, perhaps 30% of people could vote. There were, in most states, strong restrictions on who could vote. You had to own property. You had to own a substantial amount of property. You had to have been resident where you were voting for a length of time. And it was generally thought that just being a citizen did not confer upon you the right to vote. It was thought that making a choice among which of these candidates would be the best president, that was something that required, first of all, a stake in the outcome. And it was thought that you would only have a stake in the outcome if you owned property. Because there's one thing that governments always do. And in those days, the role of government was much smaller than it is today. But one thing that what is it that governments always do? In fact, exactly. That's the first thing governments do. And if you don't have any property to tax, then you could vote irresponsibly. That was the thinking. There was another thing as well, and that is in 1789, when George Washington was elected president, America was still a very elitist-oriented society. I call it sort of the age of deference in American politics. George Washington was better than anybody else. He knew it, and they knew it, and nobody took it amiss. George Washington was a president people expected to look up to. Now, this is important because by the time we get to the next one, that level of gaze is going to change. But George Washington was the wealthiest man in Virginia. He was probably the wealthiest man in the entire United States. He had been the commanding general of the victorious Continental Army. He was the one who should be president. It was as though the job description was written for him, as indeed it was. Now, if I had brought my pocket copy of the Constitution, I would pull it out, but you can just get yours out. And if you look at the Constitution, you will see that Article 1 of the Constitution, the one that deals with Congress, is quite long and very detailed. It says exactly what Congress is going to do. Article 2, which is about the presidency, is very short, and there was a reason for this. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, they were getting toward the end of the summer. They'd been there for 3 months. It was hot. They'd argued about all sorts of things. They didn't want to spend a lot of time arguing about the presidency, and they decided not to, because all they had to do was look over to the president's table. George Washington was the presiding officer over the Constitutional Convention, and they all agreed he's going to be president. So we'll let George figure it out. The reason that George Washington is one of the most important presidents is precisely that he was first, and that the description of what the job of the president is so sketchy in the Constitution. So what Washington did set the model for all sorts of things to come later. And because George Washington, the father of his country, had done it, others felt obliged to follow along. The most important thing that George Washington did while president, you know what the most important thing was? To step down. He decided to stop being president. There was then no term limit on presidents. And this was hotly debated in the Constitutional Convention, and it was debated even after George Washington was president. There were those like Alexander Hamilton who thought that the presidency ought to be like the papacy. You get elected, but then you serve for life. And so you elect basically a president for life. And he thought that this would lend stability. Hamilton was a great admirer of the British monarchy. And he thought that the closer the American presidency could be to the British monarchy, the better the country would be. But Washington really didn't want the job of being president. In those days, being president was not a particularly appealing gig. He had been the hero of the Revolutionary War, and now he's going to have to be president? No. But he was talked into it, and he allowed himself to be talked into a second term. This because his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, were at each other's throats, and the only thing they could agree on was that Washington should serve another term. But by the end of his second term, he had had enough, and he said, I'm out of here. And that set a model that lasted until the middle of the 20th century. And the model was, you only get 2 terms. Because if you try for more than 2 terms, you're implicitly saying, I'm better than George Washington. Okay, so on to Andrew Jackson. I decided for these images to use their official White House, the official presidential portraits. This one is okay. The one for Washington is pretty standard. This is the one everybody knows. Jackson, if you want a much better one of Jackson, just pull out a $20 bill. The Jackson on the $20 bill is having one of the great hair days of American history. The importance of Andrew Jackson is not what he did as president. It's that he became president. Andrew Jackson was the president who marked the end of the age of deference in American politics. He's the first president who really could be called the people's president. This for a couple of reasons. In the first place, he was the first president who was born poor. He was an orphan by his mid-teens. His family had no money, and he had to work hard, scrabble, fight for everything that he got in life. And yet he became President of the United States. That didn't happen in George Washington's day. To become George Washington, you sort of had to be George Washington. To be President of the United States, you had to be George Washington. But things changed between Washington's day and Jackson. And the most important change was in the composition of those people who could vote for president. In Washington's day, now, you'll all know that we have an electoral college. The states choose electors. In Washington's day, most of the electors were not chosen by voters. They were chosen by the legislatures of the states. So there was this double remove between the people who would choose the legislature, and the legislature would choose the electors, and the electors would choose the president. This was because in the days of George Washington, the idea of democracy was very threatening. Democracy was used in the same sense that people often use communism or socialism if you don't like Bernie Sanders. So it was this pernicious doctrine that would lead to the demise of the country. Democracy was something to be guarded against. Things changed, though, between George Washington's day and Andrew Jackson's day. And a lot of it had to do with the settlement of the West, including the state of Tennessee, which was Andrew Jackson's home. Democracy was born in the West. When people went west, they were judged more on what they could do, on their contribution to society, than on who their parents were or how much money that they had. And there was another thing. The Appalachian Mountains served as kind of a filter, leaving behind the rich folks. The rich folks didn't bother going west because they were doing quite well in the east. And the poorest folks didn't go west either because you had to have a certain amount of money to up stakes and move and to buy a new farm out there. So there was this middling group of people who went west. And when they got there, they demanded full participation. And so this is something that the western states were able to offer. And individuals like Andrew Jackson could make their mark, could rise to the top. In fact, Andrew Jackson's first and most important job in politics before becoming president was, I'll ask you, what do you think? And in fact, it was probably the most important political job in Tennessee. And it wasn't being governor of Tennessee. Judge, that's not bad, but that's close. But he was the elected Major General of the Tennessee Militia. And this was really important because in a frontier society, this is the guy who defends the society against, in this case, Indians, but also the British and anybody else who might be attacking. And so Jackson had demonstrated that this is stuff he could do. And when he was, well, he ran for election in 1824, I should say. I have to use a different term. He didn't run for election. He stood for election. In fact, the idea of putting yourself out and saying, I want you to vote for me, was something that even the most ambitious candidates for the presidency to the end of the 19th century didn't do. It was unseemly to run after the presidency. The job was more important than you, so the job was supposed to come looking for you. Just as I've made the analogy of the papacy, people don't campaign to become pope. You maybe hope that it is conferred upon you, but no. So Jackson took the position that I don't particularly want to be president. He had a fine life. But if the people call on me, then I will answer the call just the way I answered the call to duty in the various wars in the frontier and the War of 1812. Oh, there's something else about Jackson. And, if something happens once, it could be an accident. If something happens twice, then you start to look for patterns. Or as I used to say when I taught at Texas A&M, if something happens twice at Texas A&M, then it becomes a tradition. And you have to keep doing it forever and ever, even if nobody understands how it started. But what is the thing that Andrew Jackson had in common with George Washington that would set a pattern for people who become president of the United States? Military hero, exactly. And why is it that Americans have been so fond of military heroes? What is it about military heroes that makes them presumptively good candidates to be president? Thoughts? Leadership, certainly, okay? And leadership, Jackson showed remarkable leadership in the Battle of New Orleans because his army consisted of militia, it consisted of regular army troops, it consisted of Spanish and French, it consisted of pirates and various Indian tribes. A lot of those people didn't want to be there. They didn't want to stand up and fight against the British, who were the most battle-tested troops in the world. But they concluded that they were in greater danger of Andrew Jackson's wrath than of the wrath of the British, so they would stand and fight. So he had shown leadership, but the other thing was that soldiers have a kind of credibility in public service that mere politicians don't, because they actually put themselves on the line. They might get killed. So this is sort of the highest thing that a citizen can do. And if you come up through the military ranks and you do this, and you're successful at it, then you've got a leg up on other candidates. So with Jackson stood for office in 1824. And he got more votes, both popular votes and electoral votes, than anybody else, but not a majority of either. The election of 1824 is significant in American history because it's the first one, if you look in encyclopedias or history books, it's the first one in which a popular vote is reported. As I said, in the days of Washington, there weren't popular votes in most states for presidents. And again, we're still voting for electors. Technically, these days, in November, we're going to vote for a presidential candidate and look like we're voting for Donald Trump or whoever the Democratic nominee might be. Technically, we're voting for the electors, and that's still true. In Jackson's day, you would go in Tennessee, for example, and you would see the list of electors, and their names would be there. And they say, okay, if you elect us as electors, we're going to vote for Jackson. But anyway, Jackson got more votes than anybody else, but he didn't get a majority, so the vote went to the House of Representatives, where he lost. And his supporters were outraged. They believed that Jackson had been corruptly deprived of the presidency. He ran, if you think presidential elections are long today, the presidential election of 1828 began on Inauguration Day in 1825 because the Jacksonians were so outraged that their election had been stolen. In 1828, he won. He won again in 1832, and he established the principle that the presidency is peculiarly the office of the people. I said that when people sort of looked to George Washington, they were quite happy to look up to George Washington. With Andrew Jackson Andrew Jackson prided himself, and people prided themselves in Jackson's day, on they could look the president right in the eye. And from Jackson's day to this, if you want a single criterion for determining which of two candidates is going to be president, the one who can come across as sort of just an ordinary person, that's the one that's likely to get elected. That wasn't the case in Washington's day. Washington was expected to be extraordinary, but since Jackson, in fact, presidential candidates after Jackson, even if they don't have the common touch, they have to fake it. And so this is where we've been ever since. This is one of the lasting effects of Andrew Jackson on the presidency. This is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, like Andrew Jackson, was born poor and worked his way up. In the case of Abraham Lincoln, if there's a single takeaway from Abraham Lincoln's presidency, it is the enormous power that is implicit in the presidency. I teach history. I teach history of various kinds, American history, and one of the things that I point out, that there are certain moments in history where an individual can make a big difference. Now, in most of what we do, in most of history, individuals really aren't that important. There's so many other people involved in stuff, and they're just, any individual is kind of swimming in the middle of a big stream. But occasionally, a president like Abraham Lincoln can make all the difference in the world. And here's the difference in Abraham Lincoln's case. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. His election prompted 7 southern states initially and then 4 other states following to secede from the Union, claiming that the institution of slavery and their rights as states were in danger because this Republican president, a president at the head of an anti-slavery party, endangered what they held dear. And so the 7 and 4 more states decided to leave the Union. The question is, what is the government of the United States going to do about it? It wasn't automatic that secession would lead to a military conflict. There were plenty of people in the North who said, we don't like Southerners, they obviously don't like us, so let's just go. And to try to hold the Union together is like holding a bad marriage together. Maybe you could do it by force of arms, but it's not going to be good for either party. Interestingly, among those people who were most willing for the South to go were abolitionists. Abolitionists who said, you know, we felt sullied being in the same country, the same government, the same republic with these slaveholders. Now they're gone, so let them go. But Lincoln decided that the Union must be held together. If Abraham Lincoln, if the President of the United States at that time, had said, let the South go, there would not have been a civil war, and the South would have become an independent country. Now, what would have happened after that, who knows? But he was the one person who could say, no, this won't be allowed to happen. He tried to talk the South sort of down off of the ledge, and in his first inaugural address, he said, I hope we don't have to be enemies. We can work this out. But he said, you're not going to leave the Union. And when Lincoln reinforced the Union post, the Union fort, at Fort Sumter and the fighting began, then he was the one who held the Union together. From the perspective of world history, this is probably the most important thing that a U.S. president ever did. If the United States, the American Republic, had fallen apart in 1861, I would add that a lot of observers in Europe, for example, expected the Union to fall apart, expected this experiment in self-government to implode, that people can't govern themselves. Are you kidding? That's why we have kings. This is why we have emperors and all this stuff. Ordinary people govern themselves. And so for Lincoln, this was critical. And it was, Lincoln initially did not fight the South to free the slaves. That was a side effect. His goal was to preserve the Union. He believed that the Constitution said he must do this. But he also understood that to let the South go, when the South included Texas, when the South included territory west of the Mississippi River, that would destroy even the North. Because whoever controlled the southern part of the Mississippi River controlled the entire Mississippi Valley. I've often thought it would be an interesting historical experiment. If Texas had not seceded, Texas and Louisiana had not seceded by, early on, then Lincoln might have been tempted to say, okay, just let the South go because it's not a threat to the future of the United States. Once Texas, once the Trans-Mississippi, the states that are going to join the Confederacy leave, then he has no choice. But the takeaway from Abraham Lincoln is that the President of the United States potentially is the most powerful person in the world. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt becomes president by accident. And Theodore Roosevelt became president because he was an obnoxious governor of New York. He was obnoxious to the Republican political machine that ran New York. And the boss of the machine, a man named Tom Platt, I say machine, this is the political organization. It was pretty corrupt. They were taking money and bribes from everybody. And they wanted to run New York. And they got this guy, Roosevelt, who was the governor, and he wanted to govern New York honestly, and this wasn't the way things were supposed to go. So Tom Platt, the boss of New York, decided, okay, how can I get rid of this guy? And it perhaps crossed his mind to have him killed, but that wasn't the way the game was played. He thought, I know the next best thing, I will disappear him. I'll make him vice president. Because the vice presidency it was like a witness protection program. People went in and they were never heard from again. And Roosevelt somehow didn't realize what was happening to him, and he got booted into the vice presidency, and there he was. He was so bored as vice president. When Roosevelt was a young man, just out of college, he started in law school at Columbia University, but he dropped out. And so when he became vice president, trying to figure out, what am I going to do with myself? Because the only thing the vice president does by Constitution is preside over the Senate. And that's not a full-time job because you only have to show up when it looks like it's going to be a really close vote. So Roosevelt was so bored that he seriously considered going back to law school while he was vice president. But he didn't. He didn't because William McKinley got assassinated and Theodore Roosevelt became president. Now, Roosevelt is a good example in this regard of a certain characteristic in some presidents. And that is, there are individuals who could never get into the White House through the front door. That is, by being elected in their own right. They can often become very important presidents, but their politics don't match with their party. Or there's something about politics at the time that prevents them from becoming president. If not for the death of William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt would have served out his term as vice president, and that would have been that. He was too much of a maverick for the Republican Party, it was his party, for the Republican Party to nominate him for anything. So McKinley would have served out his term, and Roosevelt would have probably gone back and finished law school and become a lawyer or something like that. But McKinley was assassinated. Unfortunately, in American history, there have been a pattern of people who have been assassinated, and presidents simply die in office of natural causes. So the vice president sometimes becomes president. And once he became president, Theodore Roosevelt put his mark on the presidency. He said the right thing. He said in his first annual message, in those days, the State of the Union was actually a written message. But what he said in his first annual message after the death of McKinley was that I will carry out the policies of my elected predecessor. It turned out, as observers said, that when he said carry out, he meant sort of carry out the way we carry out the garbage. Because he soon imposed his own will on the presidency. And the main thing that he did was to basically show that the President of the United States could be as powerful as the most powerful businessman in the United States. Now, this might strike you as odd, but there was a time, in fact, in most of the 19th century, the President was not an important figure. It wasn't even the best job necessarily in American politics. There were great political careers that didn't include the presidency. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Calhoun, all these were great figures who never became president, because the presidency was not intended to be the center of American politics. That's why it's Article 2 in the Constitution, not Article 1. Congress was supposed to drive the American political system at the national level. The president was simply supposed to execute the will of Congress. Things changed with Roosevelt. because he refused to be second to anybody. Theodore Roosevelt was one who, when he entered a room, everybody knew he was there. And he insisted on being the center of things. His daughter, who knew her father, they didn't get along, but she knew her father, and she said one time, if you want to understand my father, you have to bear in mind that he has to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. So, this was Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt also understood something that, in fact, has been important ever since. How to massage the media. Now, at any given time, there's one principal medium. And the medium in Theodore Roosevelt's day was mass circulation newspapers. And Roosevelt knew how to bring newspaper reporters into the White House. He would make them almost co-conspirators. He would explain what he was going to do, but he would tell them all this off the record. And the rules were that if you reported something that was supposed to be off the record, you would be cast out of the White House and never allowed back in. And for those people who reported out of turn, he set up something he called the Ananias Club for the famous liar in the New Testament. But he made himself the center of American politics, partly through just force of personality, partly because he was young. He is still the youngest person ever to occupy the White House. And he had this large family of young kids. Most presidents, by the time they become president, especially in those days, if they had children, the children were up and grown. But Roosevelt's kids were little. And so they were part of the fun, and they were running around. But the main thing is, and this is crucial, the presidency until Roosevelt's day was a part-time job. It was a part-time job because the president really just responded to Congress. And Congress was, well, it was more of a full-time enterprise than, say, the Texas legislature, which meets only every other year, but Congress only met a few months out of each year. And so presidents had a lot of time off. The other thing is, the United States until Roosevelt's day, until the beginning of the 20th century, did not have an important, any kind of thing approaching a full-time foreign policy. Presidents have it all over Congress in determining foreign policy. But in the 19th century, the 18th century, Americans' foreign policy was quite intermittent. So 19th century presidents didn't do much in the way of foreign policy. With Roosevelt, with the beginning of the 20th century, the United States develops a full-time foreign policy. And this is Roosevelt's legacy, this and making the presidency the centerpiece of American politics. For newspapers, for the modern media, it's much easier and more appealing to write about the president than it is to write about Congress. In the case of Congress, you've got to have to deal with 535 people. With the president, you only have to deal with one. So you can focus people's attention. You can tell a story about an individual. Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was the fifth cousin once removed of Theodore Roosevelt. And he was one, so Theodore Roosevelt probably would not have become president without the death by assassination of William McKinley. Franklin Roosevelt probably would not have become president without something that befell him personally. And what befell Franklin Roosevelt? Polio. He contracted polio at the age of 39. And this is not to say that Roosevelt might not have been elected if things had been differently, but here one of the big deals is timing. Every president who is candid and honest will say that he became president in part through good luck, good timing. If Franklin Roosevelt had not come down with polio in 1921, he probably would have been nominated by the Democrats for president in 1924. He had been nominated for vice president in 1920. He was the most appealing candidate the Democrats had. But because of his polio, because of the physical therapy he was undergoing, he spent the next several years out of politics. And because he did, the nomination didn't go to Roosevelt. It went to Al Smith in 1928, went into John Davis in 1924. But the point was that Roosevelt was out of politics during this time, during the 1920s. And he was out of politics at a time when national politics was dominated by Republicans. Republicans were the normal majority party in the 1920s. And so if he would have gotten the Democratic nomination in 1924, he would have lost. And he would have been sort of damaged goods after that, and that would have been the end of it. In fact, he was out of politics. He was out of national politics until the stock market crashed. At which time, then all of a sudden the Republicans don't look so attractive. And so he's in a position where he can take the Democratic nomination in 1932 at a time when any Democrat is going to beat Herbert Hoover. And this is kind of one of the lessons of the presidency, and that is that if good things happen when you are president, you raise your hand and take credit. If bad things happen when you are president, you try to dodge, but you get saddled with the blame. Herbert Hoover might have turned out to be a very good president had he been elected in 1920, or maybe even 1924. He was elected in 1928 and had the misfortune of having the stock market crash and the economy plummet on him. Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt is known for the New Deal. He's known for his leadership in World War II. The two are closely connected. Roosevelt's job, his primary responsibility during his first two terms, something new is coming up because he's going to get more than 2 terms. He's going to break the Washington Rule. Why did he break the Washington Rule? Because Europe had gone to war, Asia had gone to war, and Americans were willing to take a third termer rather than a third rater, as he said about his opponent in 1940. But the point was that World War II came along and rescued the reputation of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been elected to end the Depression. The Depression didn't end in the United States until the war began. The war began in Europe first. So the war gives Roosevelt an excuse to run for president a third time. And he has sufficient vote-getting power that he gets elected a third time and then a fourth time. Now, what did this do? First of all, it allowed Roosevelt to be considered one of the greatest presidents in American history. There are 3 who are considered sort of the great triumvirate. There's George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, if not for the accident, and I say historical accident because it was beyond his control, of World War II, he would have left the White House after the 1940 election considered probably a failure because his New Deal programs had not ended the Depression and he hadn't accomplished what he'd been elected for. The war came along, and not only did it give him 5 more years, 2 more elections, but it also reinforced the idea that the New Deal had helped lift the American economy out of the Depression. In fact, it wasn't the New Deal, but the New Deal program came along, the economy came out of the Depression. There was this war that intervened that was the thing that lifted the country out of the Depression. But when the good things happen if you're president, then you get credit. Ronald Reagan. One thing I forgot to say. Just as Theodore Roosevelt had been the master of the medium of his day, newspapers, Franklin Roosevelt was the master of the medium of his day. The medium of his day was what medium? Radio. And Roosevelt understood the power of radio in reaching beyond newspapers. Most newspapers in the country were owned and run by Republicans who didn't like Franklin Roosevelt. But he could go around the newspapers by speaking directly to people via radio. He recognized that radio is this remarkably intimate medium. So Roosevelt could be speaking to 75 million Americans through one of his fireside chats. But if you were there listening to that big box, which is what radios looked like in those days, then you could imagine he was speaking directly to you. The master of the next medium to come along was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the television president. He practiced for being TV president by being a film star, except not really a star. Here's another thing, this sort of odd happenstance of history. If Ronald Reagan had been a better film actor, he never would have been president. He would have spent his whole career in Hollywood. When he decided to go into politics, one of the Hollywood moguls heard that he was running for governor of California. This was his first gig in politics. And Jack Warner said, no, Jimmy Stewart for governor, Ronald Reagan for best friend. That was the kind of role that he had. He was best friend. But his film career faded to black, and he had to do something else. He became a representative for the General Electric Corporation for a while, And then he decided, and then he started giving speeches on behalf of political figures. And in 1964, when Republican nominee Barry Goldwater's candidacy was about to go down in flames against Lyndon Johnson, he gave a speech. And he gave a speech that was supposedly in support of Barry Goldwater's candidacy. But if you watch the speech in this day of YouTube, you can go see the speech. He gets probably 2/3 of the way into this half-hour speech before he ever mentions Barry Goldwater. It's really clear that Ronald Reagan is auditioning for the role as President of the United States. In fact, the very next day after this speech appeared on TV, there were Reagan for President committees formed around the country. But he understood that in those days, you couldn't start out with the presidency as your first office. You had to get elected to something else first. So he got elected governor of California twice, and then he becomes President of the United States. What's the historical significance of Ronald Reagan? Ronald Reagan is the conservative right parenthesis to Franklin Roosevelt's liberal left parenthesis. With Franklin Roosevelt, America embarks on the age of 20th century liberalism, by which I mean government programs grow and multiply. The thinking of most Americans is that government can be an important part of the solution to America's problems. And that idea persisted through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the 60s. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society was a good example of this. In the age of the New Deal and the age of the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, new government programs came thick and fast. Too fast for many Americans by the time Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980. And Americans by 1980 said, no, we got too many of these, government is growing too big. So Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980, and in his first inaugural address, he says that in our current situation, government is not the solution, government is the problem itself. So here's Franklin Roosevelt another way of looking at it. Franklin Roosevelt gives the pendulum of American politics a strong push in a liberal direction. The pendulum goes and goes and goes until it's gone too far. And Ronald Reagan comes along and says, okay, time to give it a push back in a conservative direction. So that's where we are. No, this is where we are. And so a question is, this is a question I pose to my students, is the current president, and this is our current president, is this somebody who will be considered an important president? Somebody who might be the next one on my list if I'm still giving this 30, 40 years from now? And this is, well, I will tell you. So the first thing is that the jury is out on any president until that president has a chance to get reelected. And if the president tries for reelection and fails, that president is doomed forever to reside in, at best, the second tier of American presidents. And this because when you run for president the first time, you run on the promise. Can you actually promise? Can you make people think you're going to do great stuff? You run the second time on the performance. So the second time is actually a referendum. How did you do? Did you deliver? So with any president in a first term, I said this about George W. Bush in his first term, I said this about Barack Obama in his first term, I said this about Donald Trump in his first term. We have to wait and see. If he gets elected, then we have to take him seriously. If you list the top 10 presidents by the judgment of political scientists and historians, they all are presidents who've been elected in their own right. So they're incumbents who've been elected. Sometimes there are people like Theodore Roosevelt, who wasn't elected the first time. He became president by the death of his predecessor, but then ran for election while an incumbent. And he won a thundering victory. Lyndon Johnson is one of those important presidents. He became president upon the death, again, by assassination of John Kennedy, but he was elected overwhelmingly in 1964. So if you're in office and you get elected, then you automatically jump into the top 10 or dozen. So we don't know yet. We'll have to wait until November. But there are some indications that this is a different kind of president. Now, again, but see, the thing is, being a different kind of president, if it works well enough for Trump to get reelected, then it will be a change. It'll be a fork in the road. If he doesn't get reelected, then it was kind of an oops moment, and we can just forget about it. But there are certain things. So one thing is, what does Donald Trump have in common with these three? Master of the medium of the day. And with Donald Trump, it is Twitter. Using social media to get out and to bypass the filters of it could be television or of newspapers or of radio. He can go directly to the people. He's really the first internet president in that regard. Now, the second thing is that Donald Trump has demonstrated that all these things we thought that presidents couldn't do because nobody had done them before, he can do. And so far he's been able to succeed. So we always thought that you had to be candid about your finances. We always thought that you had to act presidential. We always thought that you had to try to be consistent in telling a story, that the word of the president was something that had to be defended. And so with Donald Trump, he'll say one thing one day and an opposite thing the next day, and maybe you don't know which is right, but they can't both be right. And so he's demonstrated that the president can change the message. The president can't, well, in another respect, he's very much like Theodore Roosevelt, in that Theodore Roosevelt made himself the story. And newspapers couldn't resist. And cameras and the media today cannot resist Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been the best thing for the bottom line of MSNBC and of the New York Times and the Washington Post. They don't like his politics, but they cover the story in part because their readers and their viewers like to get their daily dose of disgust or dismay or whatever it is. So being the center of the story is really important. But there's one other thing, it's a structural thing, and this is something that distinguishes Donald Trump from Franklin Roosevelt and from Ronald Reagan. Franklin Roosevelt was the first president who really could seriously be called the leader of the free world, and who believed that it was incumbent on the President of the United States, as the leader of the most powerful country in the world, to establish an international regime that, on occasion, might not be to the narrow benefit of the United States, but kept the world peaceful. It was Franklin Roosevelt who insisted on he set the pattern that gave rise to the United Nations, that gave rise to eventually the World Trade Organization. It set up this system of collective security where the United States joins with other countries to deter violence around the world, and free trade. That the United States will open its markets and the markets of the world, believing that when countries trade with each other, they don't go to war with each other. Every president from Franklin Roosevelt through Ronald Reagan, through Barack Obama, adhered to this view that the United States needed to lead the world by force of example. Donald Trump has said no. In fact, this idea that the United States has a responsibility to anybody outside the United States. He says, this is not my view, and this should not be the view of the United States. Donald Trump wants to take, in foreign policy, the United States back to the 1920s and 1930s, where it was this very competitive view, and it's sort of our country against the other countries. Now, we will see if American voters think this is a good idea or not. So I don't know what the judgment of history is going to be on Donald Trump. And we'll have to wait and see what the judgment of voters are on Donald Trump. And once again, this takes me back to the very beginning and say we get the presidents we deserve. So we've got Donald Trump, and are we going to get him again? We'll see. Okay. How about some questions? Are there any questions? We have time for questions. Yes, there's a question.
Let's say that miraculously overnight there's a slate that comes up in next to Mount Rushmore, and you get to pick 3 presidents that you put on it. Who do you pick and why?
Okay, besides the ones that are there?
Besides the ones that are there.
Okay, I would go with Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson, I believe, was sort of the great spokesman of American liberty. He was the close. Oh, who? If we add faces to Mount Rushmore, who's going to go up there? Okay, so let's see, who then? I would put Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt is really kind of the model of the 20th century president. And I need one more than that. Okay.
What's wrong with Dwight Eisenhower?
Eisenhower is reasonable. The thing about Eisenhower is that Eisenhower was a really status quo president in that, okay, he becomes president. Oh, yeah. And so, this was a question about president. So, a great soldier, an effective president, but not a president who changed things. He didn't turn the direction of American politics. Now, one could argue that sometimes it's better just to keep things the way they are. Yeah, I understand. Okay, we can talk. Actually, so I'm going to, while I'm still thinking about the answer to the third one, I'm going to tell you a basic principle about American presidents and who gets considered great. And this is this. I said that the three great presidents are always Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And I'm going to tell you that, and this was no disrespect to the father of our country, but George Washington was great because he was the first. It's not particularly anything that he did while president. You can't point to his policies and say this was a great policy. There is the fact that he stepped down, and that's fine. It's kind of a negative thing. Leaving aside Washington, the great presidents are Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. And why are they the great presidents? Because they had a great opportunity to stamp their moment in history with their ideas, with their actions. Why was that the case? Because the United States was in crisis during their presidency. Abraham Lincoln would never have had a chance to demonstrate that he could hold the Union together if the Union didn't break apart. He never would have had a chance to free the slaves if not for the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt would not have had a chance to be sort of the father of the modern welfare state and the leader of the free world if not for the Great Depression and World War II. So here's the paradox, that the greatest presidents in American history preside over the worst moments in American history. And this is not so odd as it sounds, because most Americans, most of the time, are reasonably satisfied with the way things are. In fact, I'm going to put out something right now that might seem odd or even perverse to you, but we seem polarized. Congress can't get anything done. And I say, well, there are a variety of reasons for that, but part of it is that things are working pretty well as we go. We don't need a solution to things. It's not like the banking system is collapsing the way it was in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt became president. It's not like the Union is falling apart the way it was when Abraham Lincoln became president. So I ask my students, and I just show of hands, how many of you would like to be president one day? And most of them, they kind of look around at their friends. If I raise my hand, they'll think, boy, I think a lot of myself. I put the question occasionally, if you know what boys' state and girls' state is, these are the practice governments for high school students. When I put the question to them, they all raise their hand. They're quite willing to say, I want to be president. But if you want to be a great president, then you almost have to ask for disaster to befall the country. So for somebody like this is a long-winded response to Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower did not have the opportunity to be a great president because nothing disastrous happened while he was president. So, good president, I'm still thinking, I'd be tempted to put Lyndon Johnson up there. I mean, Lyndon Johnson, he does have that hangover of Vietnam. But in terms of a president who could lead the United States into the 20th century on race relations, this is Lyndon Johnson. And there's an important point about Lyndon Johnson here, and that is this has to do with presidents who couldn't get in the front door. Lyndon Johnson could not have gotten in the front door of the White House, that is, to get elected in his own at first. Why? Because Lyndon Johnson was from the South. From the Civil War, actually from 1848 until 1964, the United States had not elected a Southerner president. And this because the South was the region of Jim Crow. The South was the region of segregation. Northerners were kind of embarrassed about the whole system of segregation in the South. Not embarrassed enough to do anything about it, but they didn't want to be reminded about it, and so they wouldn't accept a Southerner as the nominee. The political parties didn't even nominate Southerners for president. But there's a kind of a catch-22 that goes on here. The South was not going to accept desegregation if it was imposed upon them by a Northerner. So when John Kennedy was elected president, John Kennedy had his friends in the Senate propose a civil rights bill, but the bill was going nowhere because the South would not be lectured to on civil rights by a liberal Yankee. It required a Southerner to tell the South the time has come to move into the 20th century. And so Lyndon Johnson became president not by getting elected the first time, but by the death of John Kennedy. And so it was Johnson who dragged the United States kicking and screaming into an era closer to racial equality. So I'd be tempted to make him the third. Other questions or reactions? Sure. And I can repeat the question. I don't say, there's a hand. Well, here's a hand, and then another one. So you first, and then you. Yes.
Reverse your discussion. Tell us who the three worst presidents, or the three presidents who are probably did the most damage to the United States.
Yeah. So this is a tough one, and it's a tough one in that when you are really in the basement, it's hard to know, well, is this worse than that? Okay, I would say that first of all tell you the general feeling on this. James Buchanan is the worst because James Buchanan did nothing while the South seceded. I have a little bit of a soft spot in my heart for James Buchanan because his position actually was consistent. His position was the South does not have the right to leave the Union. Nor does the Constitution give me as president the authority to wage war to keep the South in the Union. It's a perfectly legitimate position. Abraham Lincoln took a different position, but I think Abraham Lincoln did a certain violence to the Constitution in doing what he did. But Buchanan is the one who's usually considered, okay, he let the Union fall apart. And historians have this strong preference for explaining the things that did happen rather than the things that didn't. And so if you know that the Union, England is going to hold the Union together, then you want to explain that. So Buchanan is one. Warren Harding often gets tagged with being a president who had a mistress while he was in the White House, and he couldn't be bothered to keep track of who was stealing money from the Navy Department, and then he died before everything, kind of fell in, and he left behind this mess. So there's not a lot positive to be said for Warren Harding. Yeah, well, see, this is where you get to the 19th century, and you could pick a dozen unmemorable presidents of the 19th century, and I really don't want to pick on any of them because, as I suggested earlier, by the design of the Constitution, presidents were supposed to be unmemorable. They really weren't supposed to be the center of attention. I've been studying presidents for a long time, and I have to think carefully. Okay, so how does Pierce measure up against Millard Fillmore and John Tyler and Zachary Taylor and Chester Arthur? And this Chester Arthur, he might be one. He became president upon the death of James Garfield. Well, see, then you also get people like James Garfield and William Henry Harrison who didn't live long enough to do anything. And so you can't really say that they're bad, but if a president is supposed to do stuff good, then so this is why, actually, I'll tell you, there are various groups. Siena College is one. That every 5 years sends out this flyer, or email flyer version, and you're supposed to rank presidents on all sorts of things. And I decline to participate in this because the presidency is not a beauty contest. And the other thing is, and this actually is important, I mean, that's just my own preference, but it's tempting to say, boy, what this country needs is another Theodore Roosevelt, or another Abraham Lincoln, or even another Ronald Reagan. The answer is no, it doesn't. And here's why. To be a successful president, you have to fit your moment in time. And moments change. And so Theodore Roosevelt was an advocate of bigger government in his day. So does that make him a liberal? Well, I have no idea. Because the government that he inherited, the federal government he inherited, was a tenth the size of the current federal government. And Roosevelt might have thought, okay, double the size of government then and stop. Well, so then he would be a small government conservative today. Abraham Lincoln was suited for his time, but if he had come along 20 years earlier, 20 years later, I have no idea. So this is one where ranking presidents was Chester Arthur worse than Warren Harding, worse than James Buchanan. It is really hard to tell. So somebody else had a hand up. Yes?
Where's Woodrow Wilson fit in?
Okay, so Woodrow Wilson, he would be in my sort of next tier, and I almost included him. And the reason I almost included him was that we live in, well, until January 20th, 2017, we lived in the age of Woodrow Wilson in the following sense. Woodrow Wilson is most important as the leader of the United States in foreign policy who articulated the idea of collective security, that America's security, the security of democracy in America, depends on the state of democracy in the world. When Wilson led the United States into World War I, he said, we need to make the world safe for democracy. And Wilson had this idea of the League of Nations, this idea that the United States must band together in order to secure the peace of the world, because otherwise we will be at war again. And Americans rejected that view during Wilson's day. But Americans saw the cost of rejecting the view. It was the rise of Hitler and World War II. And so after the second one, everybody decided, hey, you know, Woodrow Wilson was right. And from 1917 until 2017, this was the age of Woodrow Wilson. The reason I say 2017 is Donald Trump has taken the opposite view, that the United States, democracy in the United States, the condition of the United States does not depend on the state of the rest of the world. And so we'll see if Americans agree with him. And then, of course, we have to see how that turns out. So one of the things that not only President Trump, but a whole lot of people underestimate is the importance of globalization for preventing World War III. So globalization has gotten a bad rap in the last 20 years or so. And yeah, there are losses of jobs in the United States, but the underappreciated part is that there has not been a World War III. Nobody in this room is old enough to fall in this category, but if you had been 20 years old in 1946 or 7, let's make you 30 years old, then you would have thought that world wars come along about every 20 years. So there's World War I in the 10s and World War II starting in the 1930s. And you would expect another world war is going to come along, but it didn't. Now, I ask my students, so why no World War III? And I point out that, okay, why no World War III yet? Because we might still. And I think one of the most important and unappreciated reasons is precisely that the United States, the most powerful country in the world, which could have lorded it over everybody else, said no. We're going to build this system where other people have an incentive to buy into the system. And so we'll accept smaller marginal gains we might have otherwise, but it will be for the good of the whole system. And so when Germany, when Japan, when they revived after World War II, they didn't revive in a militaristic sense, they revived in an economic sense. And yes, Japanese cars took jobs from American auto workers, but those auto workers, so their kids didn't have to go off and fight World War III. Now, it's possible that that had nothing to do with the absence of World War III. It's possible that the humans have simply become peaceful and we don't fight anymore. Okay, but these things happen, and President Trump has taken a position that is embraced by a lot of people. I'll repeat what I said before. We get the presidents we deserve. A whole lot of Americans said, we're tired of paying for the defense of Europe. We're tired of doing all this stuff. We're tired of subsidizing China's export industry. Now, if Woodrow Wilson were around, he would say that's the cost of preserving democracy, of making democracy safe. Do we have time for one more question? One more question.
What about Truman?
Truman, he would be up there too, yes.
What percent of FDR's greatness is related to Eleanor?
I wrote a book about Franklin Roosevelt, but I originally pitched it to my publisher with a dual title. It was going to be Franklin and Eleanor. And I wanted this because, as an American historian, it's hard to find really influential women in public life. Women have been influential in private life, but they don't rise to the level of sort of presidents and big politics stuff. But Eleanor Roosevelt is one. I would say that Eleanor Roosevelt remains the most powerful woman in American political history. If Hillary Clinton had gotten elected in 2016, she would have taken that position, but she didn't. So until now, Eleanor Roosevelt's the most powerful woman in American political history. And to understand Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, you need to understand Eleanor Roosevelt. In part because she had influence on the way policies were devised, but also for the relationship between Franklin and Eleanor, which was a very interesting and complicated relationship. But with Eleanor, there's a fascinating story. It starts with the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt was Eleanor Roosevelt before she married Franklin Roosevelt. And when she married Franklin Roosevelt, she was Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt. And in fact, on their wedding day, Theodore Roosevelt, the reason she was Eleanor Roosevelt was she was Theodore Roosevelt's niece. She was the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt's brother. And so her father had died. And so Theodore Roosevelt, in the tradition, gave the bride away on the wedding day. And he congratulated Franklin, said, "Frank, there's nothing like keeping the name in the family." But Eleanor Roosevelt was born into this political family. But she didn't have the, and she lived at a time when women had just gotten the vote. So she could have run for office, but she didn't have that personality. She didn't have that drive where she wanted to be the one out front. She had strong intuitions and strong ideas about how policy ought to be. She didn't like the politics part of it. So she's a really good example of, in American political history, there are two tracks to influence. There is the elective track. You run for office, you get elected, and you make these decisions. Then there are people who are appointed to positions. They're appointed to Secretary of State, they're appointed to Supreme Court, they're appointed to all these positions. And they have lots of influence, but it requires a different set of characteristics. And Eleanor had that. But when she was First Lady of the United States and her husband was President, she actually had more public exposure. She was more in the public eye than he was. She had a newspaper column that was syndicated in hundreds of newspapers around the country and ran 6 days a week. Imagine, columnists these days, if they do 2 columns a week, they think they're overworked. She had 6 days a week. She had a radio show. But there was this tag team approach between Franklin and Eleanor, because Eleanor was sort of the bleeding heart liberal conscience of the New Deal. And so she would get out there. For example, she was strongly in favor of a federal anti-lynching law. And she understood that if you can end the scourge of lynching in the South, it has to be made a federal crime because state laws don't do it. Judges and juries in the white South are not going to convict people for lynching. They just didn't. So you need to make it a federal crime. And this because federal judges are appointed. State judges are typically elected. And to be elected and re-elected, you have to do things that are popular with your constituents. Federal judges can be just as unpopular as they need to be to enforce the law. So Eleanor was all in favor of this federal anti-lynching law. Franklin Roosevelt said, "Well, I'm with you in spirit, honey, but I can't do it because my New Deal coalition, my Democratic coalition, relies on the support of conservative white Southerners." The Democratic Party in the 1930s was this odd coalition of big city liberals and ethnics and white conservative Southerners. And this is what got Franklin Roosevelt elected. He said, "I can't risk losing them because then we lose the whole New Deal." So they were able to have it both ways. Eleanor would go out there and she would tell her liberal friends, "My husband is with you in spirit, but politics just prevents him from doing anything now, maybe next term." And he would say to his conservative critics of his wife, "What can you do with the missus?" Anyway, I've run out of time. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience.
Wonderful. Again, join me in thanking Bill Brands. So we'll have refreshments and we'll continue the conversation in the rotunda. Thank you for joining us.